said, oh, this must be a sidebar, which is a valid sidebar to look at it. But there's no other article. This is on the day of this massive march. Okay, let me turn to the Washington Post. It's happening in Washington after all. Turn from the front page. Well, this is on page A3 or page A4. Another piece. Is it by the same person? It's on the growth of the anti-choice movement, and that's it. On the day of this massive march, you have two pieces on the growth of the anti-choice movement. And then what happens? The largest march possibly in the history of this country on any issue. In Washington, D.C., more than 1 million women and their supporters. And what do we get the next day? Well, that did earn these protesters a front page picture in the New York Times and Washington Post. I mean, what does it take? When you think about if this was a pro-war rally, you would have it's about the drumbeat coverage. It's about what you get every day. You would have following the bus from Michigan, who are the people. You'd follow a family from Tennessee and what they look like, what they felt, and then, you know, what happens when they gather. Instead, you get the piece. This has to change, but it is changing the world. This massive, not even quiet, global uprising against the powers that be, and it's happening all over. I have a tremendous amount of hope. I always tell the story of East Timor because it's a story of despair, but also, in the end, hope. Because in the face of the worst odds, people can prevail. You know the story because of Pacifica Radio, because we have the only independent media network broadcasting in this country that stayed with the story for many years. That country that was occupied by Indonesia in 1975, one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. Noam Chomsky never let this story go from 1975 on, kept it alive in this country. In 1990, I got a chance to go there with another journalist, Alan Nair. In 91, we went back. And on November 12th, 1991, as we were covering a procession protesting yet another young man killed, we went to the cemetery, as thousands of Timorese did, women in their traditional Timorese garb, girls in their Catholic school uniforms, boys in their Catholic school shorts, marching through this geography of pain that was Dili, the capital of Timor. Every other building, an army barracks or a police headquarters or a hotel where a Timorese was tortured or disappeared at the back as the guests ate in the front. As the procession wove its way through Dili, they made their way to the Santa Cruz Cemetery. It was the boldest act of civil disobedience the Indonesian military had ever seen. In a land of no freedom of assembly, no freedom of press, no freedom of speech, the people of Timor were talking just by putting their hands up in the V sign. They had gone to mass in the morning and then marched through the streets holding up banners that said things like, "Why the Indonesian military shoot our church," appealing to President Bush Sr. at the time, to the UN, to someone to do something about their situation. And when they got to the cemetery, they were all standing in the road, exhilarated but terrified at what they'd done. And from the direction the procession had come, hundreds of Indonesian soldiers, their US M16s at the ready position. The Timorese trapped by the walls on either side of the road. Only the people at the back could run away. Alan and I in the middle of the crowd questioning people, why are you doing this? Why did you march? And them saying, for my mother, or for my father, for my brother, for my village that was wiped out. And then from the direction the procession had come, these soldiers marching. And Alan suggested we walk to the front of the crowd, because although we knew they had committed many massacres in the past, the Indonesian military, never had they done it in front of Western journalists. And so we pulled out our equipment that we always hid because it would endanger the Timorese who were caught talking to us. And we pulled it out in full view. I put on my headphones, I put up my mic, Alan put the camera above his head, and we walked to the front of the crowd. And the soldiers marched up, and they kept marching 12 to 15 abreast, and they rounded the corner. They swept past us without hesitation or provocation or warning. They opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left. First to go down, a little boy behind us, his hands up in the V sign, exploding from the gunfire. and then the soldiers kept shooting, beating us to the ground. Alan threw himself on top of me to protect me from further injury, and they took their US M16s like baseball bats, and they fractured his skull. We were lying in the road. Alan was covered in blood. They were killing everyone around us. Soldiers had the guns at our heads, and they started shouting at us, politique, politique, because to witness something like this, part of what we're journalists do is to bear witness. To witness something like this is political. And they asked, Australia, Australia, because in 1975, 17 years before, when Indonesia invaded, there were 6 reporters, 6 members of 2 Australian TV crews that were covering the events leading up to the invasion. They took 5 of them, put them against a house, and executed them. The last Australian reporter reporting from the world from a radio station in Dili, the capital, they dragged out of the radio station, and as he shouted, "I'm from Australia," they shot him into the harbor. We later learned, years later, the Australian government hardly raised a peep of protest over this, and figured it was because years later the Indonesian and Australian foreign ministers went up in a plane and signed the Timor Gap Treaty that divided up the oil spoils, not with Timor, but between Indonesia and Australia. Oil has caused so much pain in the world. So we said as we lay on the ground, no, we're from America, America. They'd stripped us of everything except I had my passport still, threw it at them. And as the soldiers joined in this firing squad, we kept shouting, America, America. And they finally pulled the guns from our heads. We believed because we were from the same country their weapons were from, they would have to pay a price for killing us that they'd never had to pay for killing the Timorese. They pulled the guns from our heads and they just kept on shooting, picking people off between the tombstones of the cemetery. We got into a Red Cross Jeep. Dozens of Timorese jumped on top of us, hanging onto the roof, onto the spare tire at the back, and we drove like that as a human mass. When we got to the hospital, the doctors and nurses started to cry when they saw us. Not because we were in worse shape than the Timorese. The Indonesian military killed hundreds of Timorese that day. But because of what we represent, and that is such an important lesson. And it's not just what we represent to the Timorese, but to the Nigerians, to the Haitians, to the Guatemalans, to people all over the world. I think we represent 2 things. One is the sword, and the other is the shield. The sword, because the US government provides US weapons to repressive regimes in so many places, or simply directly uses those weapons in places like Iraq. But also the American people represent the shield. That even the smallest act we engage in this country, in the #1 superpower on earth, has tremendous repercussions for people all over the world. Just a call to a Congress member on an issue, that ring can be heard around the world, can save a life or many. Certainly, voting can make that kind of difference, whether it's the national level or just in your community, beginning in your community, improving it, making people aware how our communities are linked all over the world. But I do think that's what we represent. And on that day, that shield was bloody, and it just further deepened the despair of the people of Timor. Well, over the next years, a nationwide movement grew up in this country, remarkable grassroots movement called the East Timor Action Network, and people called Congress members and organized against the US providing military weapons to repressive regimes. And it had enormous impact. And in 1999, the people of East Timor got a chance to vote for their freedom, and they voted overwhelmingly for it, even as the Indonesian military burned their country to the ground and killed more than 1,000 more of the Timorese. And in 2002, Alan and I had the remarkable opportunity to return to Timor to celebrate the birth of a new nation. On May 19th, May 20th, 2002, the people of Timor, 100,000 of them gathered in the sandy plain of Tasitolo just outside of Dili. And at midnight of May 19th and the 20th, Shanana Gusmao, the rebel leader of Timor, now the founding president, ascended to the stage, and he unfurled the flag of the Democratic Republic of East Timor. The fireworks went off, and the people looked up, and you could see the light reflected in their tear-stained faces. They had won. They had paid such an unbelievably high price, but this nation of survivors had resisted, and they had won.